Hello, everybody. Frank Kenny here. Want to thank you for joining us for today's chamber-focused interview. Very fortunate today to have Jim Brown with us. Now, if you don't know who Jim Brown is, he's an author and a consultant. And I met him at Northwest Chamber Leaders. He was giving a presentation on boards, and that's what we're going to talk to him about today. He's the author of this book, which Jim, I really appreciate how you dedicated it to me. You took some time and some thought there, and I'm guilty of just sometimes signing my books and not. So anyway, that's a nice touch, and that seems to be your style, is to go the extra mile a little bit. So why don't you introduce yourself a little bit to the audience?
Well, thanks, Frank. It's great to be with you and fun to connect on this Google Plus Hangout. My background is that for almost 20 years, I've been working in this business we call Strive. Our focus is helping boards be more effective and executive teams be more effective. My passion is to help leaders lead so that people can be the best they can be. And the way that that can apply in chambers is so multifaceted. I've had a number of good conversations with CEOs of chambers, and they see that their role isn't just to lead the chamber to blossom in the community, but it's also to create a context for board members to become more effective leaders, and that will trickle down to all kinds of organizations throughout the community. A great mindset.
Well, your book talks about the relationship between boards and the ownership, the membership of the chamber, and the relationship between the board and the CEO, and the relationship between the staff of the chamber and the board that the CEO is in between. And there's all sorts of mistakes people make in the chamber world. And it's, everybody involved in the chamber space has the best intentions. 99.999% of people that volunteer to be on the board of a chamber or go to work for a chamber does it because they want to serve their community, they want to serve members, but nobody really has very much training in how to be a good board member or how to be a good staff person of a chamber. So let's start with a question for you on what onboarding do you think it's necessary when you take somebody that's a plumber or a doctor or a lawyer and they're great at that, and then you ask them to be a great board member? That just doesn't happen by happenstance, does it?
That's the truth. You make a great point about good intentions, and I observe that for sure. People come to boards with the best intentions, but I often joke about how greeters at Walmart get more orientation than almost any board member ever does. We want to help board members be successful. That means we got to take some time to help them understand what their job really is. And it isn't to do what they do every day in their life in that board role. So just because the person's involved in construction, say, if we're not doing a building project in the chamber, it's not like we can't use that person's perspective. Even more, if we are doing a building project, that's not why he's there. So helping people understand that their job as a board member is to really come and help lead the organization in the best interests of the whole, all the owners, the entire membership and the community. Think strategically, big picture, as opposed to just practical. That's their main job. Meanwhile, their kind of vocation, they may have some real skills to bring and offer the CEO at the chamber, and that can be done, but it's outside of the boardroom. That's let me volunteer to help you with some advice or some expertise, and if that can be of service, then I'm happy to offer it. But that is a voluntary thing, and it's a changing of our hats as opposed to really the job of the board or board member.
So that you discussed this in your book, and I actually took notes on it, that when I used to be a chamber president and CEO, one of the board members would sometimes use their area of expertise, whether they were a lawyer or a marketing person, and all of a sudden the board meeting would be about what they think we should do as a chamber. And according to your book, that isn't exactly their role at that moment. Is that right?
Absolutely. The CEO and president is responsible for leading the operations, for doing the implementation of the strategy that is set by the board with the CEO. And it's not the same thing, right? Thinking big picture and long term, one, it's not something that everybody can do easily. So that should be a critical piece of the process of screening who gets on the board. And then once we focus on that, those people also need to be able to let go of that day-to-day interest from a meddling perspective. Of course, the board needs to monitor that we're progressing towards our objectives as we all agreed. But a phrase I use, and you may remember it from the book, is that we should operate with our noses in, but our fingers out. And again, with best intentions, lots of board members are in right up to their armpits.
Well, a lot of board members probably think that they're doing above and beyond what's expected to them, and they expect kudos, a pat on the back for getting deep involved, rolling up their sleeves and working directly with the CEO, or even going around the CEO and working with staff. And you know, and it's hard on a staff person, the CEO, to tell their board member to butt out or that it's inappropriate. But it happens all the time, doesn't it?
It does. And that's one of the ways that I can actually best serve CEOs is I can be the guy that tells them that. Or even if they would just read the book. If a different voice is saying, no, this is the way it's supposed to be done, if everybody has that kind of shared knowledge, maybe they haven't got it totally inside them, but they understand that that's the way it should be done, then it's probably fine for the CEO to remind board members about that. But it's almost political suicide for them to be campaigning on that too heavily. An outside voice can help kind of get the lines straightened out there.
Right. Well, let's take this back to the 30,000 foot level. So I'm thinking about the graphs that you use in the book. At the very top, you have the membership as the ownership. And then inside that, you have a circle that says, here's the board members. Now, they represent the ownership, but they also have an invested interest in their own success. And they maybe not really know what the ownership wants. They know what they want from the chamber, which could be more business. But you know, they have a dual role there. How do you balance that?
So you're referring to a diagram that we call the secret formula for organizational effectiveness. And it's a critical picture to really understand, especially applicable to chambers. Because let's understand that every person who becomes a member of a board of a chamber was first a member of the chamber. And they probably became a member of the chamber because they're a customer of the chamber. They're looking for the services that the chamber offers. What we all need to understand is that customers are not the people who are on the board. Owners are the people on the board. The difficult thing is it's the same people in the chamber world. So that is where discipline is required. Members of boards of chambers need to understand their job is actually to keep their owner hat on, operate on behalf of the ownership, as in what are the ownership interests of the entire membership? What do they want to see happen in our community, not just for one individual business or one individual leader, but for the entire climate that we operate our businesses in. And the moment that one person around the table starts kind of sliding the conversation towards their own camp or themselves, directly but politely, we need to just remind each other, wait a minute, we're talking about the big picture here, remember. Our job is to think about the long term and what's best for everybody. It's not about camps. And so again, if we may have the great intentions, but if we aren't reminded of these best practices, we can go into the ditch very quickly.
So if a CEO of a chamber recognizes that this has happened, that somebody is starting to look out, which is just so human nature to care about your own best interests. I mean, some of these things are serious decisions. At my chamber, we were talking about moving a road, a bypass around our city to get that highway traffic off our downtown.
Mm-hmm.
And there were people on the board that would have lost business, and there were people on the board who would gain business. And
Yeah.
so, and everybody does, human nature, you care about your own personal well-being and your future and your family. Whose role is it as a CEO to, can the CEO point this out, or really is it on the chair? Is it on the whole board to be self-governing?
Well, you just made a really good point. Let's remind ourselves that when we sit in that room, we're at the board meeting, as in, it's not the chair's meeting, it's not the CEO's meeting, it's the board's meeting. So truthfully, the entire board is responsible to make that meeting great. At the same time, the entire board has assigned responsibility to the chairman of the board to make the meeting most effective. So that chairman really should be looking for permission from the entire board, probably at the first meeting each year, to run the meeting that way. Can we just remind ourselves of the way we want to function as a board? That we're talking about big picture, strategy, we're not talking about day-to-day operations. We're talking about what's for the whole, we're not talking about what's for the individual. Just a little sidebar, Frank, can you appreciate that the moment that we talk about an individual, that should be a warning signal to everybody around the table that we're now talking about customer interests rather than owner interests. So a kind of a fun thing, and I think it's fun. Some people might not think it's fun, but it's a little bit of a nuisance to always be saying, hang on, I think you're talking about yourself and not the whole, over and over, especially if you have somebody that's like a repeat offender. What I've found some boards do is they just have like a little yellow recipe card. Everybody's got one, and they can just kind of hold it up. And that's a signal to everybody, especially the chair, that, oh yeah, I guess we just went below the line. We went from governance to operations. We went from board work to staff work, and I need to call it back up. You see what I'm getting at, Frank? That anybody around the board table can take notice of it and kind of highlight it, but it doesn't even have to happen verbally. It can happen with a little nonverbal indicator like that yellow card waving, and everybody's reminded, oh yeah. And even the reports I hear from people is that typically the person who is speaking offside sees that and says, oh, hang on, sorry about that, right. Yeah, I got to take it back above the line.
You know,
So,
as I hear what you're saying, and getting training on this, reading your book, and having somebody like you come in and try to create a culture of this would be just great. I got a couple different points here. One is, if the chamber was a national organization with thousands and thousands and thousands of members and millions of dollars in budget, and your board members were picked from a national pool, well, those would be people that you would expect to have some board training, or that would have read maybe Robert's Rules if they were really dedicated. That, you know, some people that have some acumen in boards. They've done it before and that sort of stuff. But chambers are completely, that would be the exception to find
yeah.
somebody that's had some board experience. And I would think that if a board has a culture that is not healthy, then, boy, how do you change a ship that's got inertia? And you need them to act like you're talking about, but it's just not the culture of the organization. How do you get that ship turned around?
Give me a little bit of perspective. I'm going to share my perspective here. You've seen many more chambers than I have. But my observation, Frank, is that it usually isn't like there's this long list of people jumping up and down saying, I want to be on the board, I want to be on the board. Usually it's members of the current board and the CEO president going and talking to individuals and inviting them to stand for that position. Is that your experience as well, Frank?
Yeah, generally, if a chamber is really healthy and everybody on the board is kind of seen as a upstanding citizen and something to strive for in the community, all the board seats will be taken, and a CEO and the nominating committee won't have a hard time filling those seats.
Right.
But there are a lot of chambers that have gone through hard times, or the politics inside politics was just so nasty. For whatever reason, people have dropped off the board, and they actually have vacancies year after year after year.
Mm.
And so it's sometimes hard to fill those seats. So does that help?
Well, the key point that I'm aiming at is that there's a lot of opportunity for the current leaders of the organization to be very selective about who they put in the nominating seat, so to speak. So a key to making the kind of change that we're talking about is to very thoughtfully consider who would be the right kind of person. Go and meet with them. Talk to them about their passion for the chamber to start with, because if they're not passionate about that, don't expect to get a lot of commitment from them. But beyond, just kind of how they problem solve, how they work with issues, what's their experience with thinking strategically as opposed to the nitty-gritty details every day. And then lay out, this is how our board is going to be functioning. Would you be willing to step in line with that? And if they aren't, just say, well, thanks so much for your candor, and if things change, we'll talk to you again. Like, just, again, be selective. Once you get people, a critical mass of people who really are committed to this is how we're going to function, then it's fairly easy to make that shift, because typically the people who want to be in up to their armpits, they just get tired of thinking big picture. Why can't we get down to the nitty gritty? And the board chairman says, well, because that's not really our job. So if you want to be on one of the planning committees, talk to the CEO, and he'll see whether there's a slot that needs to be filled. But our job here is to think long-term, big picture, and we're going to do that. So there's some self-selecting that happens once you start kind of writing the course.
I think in the chamber industry, it's a lot of veterans say that the most important committee you have in your chamber is the nominations committee.
Good
And
point.
so your point's well taken here, in that you get the wrong person on the bus. I forget who I'm quoting there, but you got to get
Jim
the right people.
Collins.
Jim Collins, that's right. You got to get the right people on the bus, and I have found that just getting one really wrong person on the bus, somebody that you thought had the best of intentions but really had an ulterior motive, can send a board sideways incredibly fast. Why don't we talk about that just for a quick second?
Yeah, it is so true. It makes me think of a tool that we've developed after years of working with these kinds of situations. It's something we call a leadership covenant. And it just kind of lays out about 8 different key elements of how we're expecting the board to function. And we suggest that boards review that as soon as the election is done and here's the new slate of directors for the year. Review that list, and everybody on the board signs it. And that, in a sense, is giving us license to say, this is how we're going to operate. And if we don't, we're going to say, thank you, goodbye. Indeed, that should be in our bylaws, that we have the ability to remove directors who aren't living up to the expectations outlined in that leadership covenant. There's lots more to talk about. Like, at the same time, we have the people that I would call dead wood, and I'm sure that you've seen some of that, Frank.
Yeah.
People who have been on the board probably way past their best before date, and yet, just to be friendly, we aren't saying anything. I've been in board meetings actually where some people have fallen asleep at the table, but nobody wants to say anything because he's a nice guy. Well, let's make a space for nice guys somewhere else, and make the board be a fast-paced, high-level, make it move forward, move the mountain sort of thing enterprise. Because if you want to have winners on the board, you got to get the deadwood off the board.
There's a whole lot to organization management and boards. I could talk to you for a couple hours here. Let's talk about the back to your graph that you guys created. At the bottom of the graph is a something shaped a little bit like this, and at the point is the CEO, and the CEO touches directly to the board of directors, and then the staff reports to the CEO. When you
Yeah.
created that, you must have went through many iterations, but it seems like that's the CEO has to absolutely know they're in charge of operations, and there's just no ifs, ands, or buts about that. No matter how serious a board member or the board might want to get about putting their help in on doing things and directing, it's just not the role. Can you speak to that?
Absolutely. In fact, just yesterday I was talking with Greg DeRocher, the CEO of the Cambridge Chamber, a local one for me, and he was saying how he takes time to help the board be very clear that the board has one employee, and that's him. And everybody else in the organization reports to him. He'll take care of the hiring and firing, and they will not be involved in that. Um, that in itself needs to be clarified for every organization, really, not just chamber. And that's why you've got that kind of a triangular point, one point of connection from the operational end of the organization to the governance part of the organization. And yes, there are chambers out there that they really like to have the events manager sitting around the board table to get the pulse of what the board's thinking. But um, typically that means that there's some confusion about, so who does the events manager report to? The CEO or the board? And it might be clear in the CEO's mind, but it's not clear in every board member's mind. So confusion erupts and interference occurs. It's just a train wreck waiting to happen. I'm not saying event managers should never be in a board meeting, only for a portion of the meeting where they're bringing some report or answering some questions that matter to the big picture. But generally, they would share information that's required, and the board would thank them, and they'd step out, and the conversation would continue.
What about some chambers that, especially small chambers, maybe they only have a staff of one or two, and they expect their board to be a working board. If they don't get the help at the implementation level, they sometimes get mad at the board. And a lot of board members probably don't even realize that. They thought they were more of a policy board, and here you want me to make phone calls and do selling or even bill collecting. How do you clarify all that? And is it even healthy to have a working board?
Well, I'm going to go way out on the limb, Frank, and declare it's terrible to have a working board.
Hmm.
At the same time, I totally understand the context you're speaking of. The way to address that is to make it clear that when we are meeting as a board, we meet to govern. And that meeting might be a 2-hour meeting. And then we can adjourn that meeting, and we're going to now have the, whatever you want to call it, the get it done committee meeting that's led by the CEO. And most of the board members, maybe all of them, stay in that meeting. But they've got to be able to change their hats from being, we are the board members with power saying what we think the CEO needs to do, to now being the people who are being asked to do stuff by the CEO. They are staff reporting to the CEO. And if you can't
Nice.
change your hat, you need to quit one of those two jobs.
Very interesting. I want to bring up one more topic here, and then I'll ask you for your contact information and how you can help people directly. The question is subcommittees. I have seen chambers that have a executive committee or a finance committee that ends up kind of making decisions, and nobody questions them, and well, the executive committee already decided that. How should that function?
Well, again, you probably already know this about me, Frank. I will get kind of blunt and sometimes dangerously direct. I would suggest that we should execute all the executive committees.
Really?
It's just a bad idea, and the reason for that is that most of them function like a board within a board, and that is a very dangerous arrangement. If you just kind of trace the origin of executive committees back, it's back in the days when we had horses and buggies We couldn't get together easily, especially if we were not in the same little burb. Um, so we gave a few people the power to keep things happening, especially before there was any paid staff. Well, we're looking at a different world now. So we can have the entire board connected through a Hangout in Google Plus, for example, almost instantly. So there's no reason to make decisions about governing the organization with a subset of the board and then expect that the rest of the board is supposed to just rubber stamp it and be happy about it. So that's probably going to stir up a hornet's nest. And um, hey, everybody, don't blame Frank, blame me. You can send your complaints my way. But then all the other subcommittees, they fall into two categories. They are either committees that are helping the board do its job, which is to govern the organization, or they're committees that are helping the staff do its job, which is to operate. Now, the problem we get into is when we have committees that are helping with the operations, but they report to the board. Right there, we've violated the secret formula. We've done an end run around the CEO. And what we should do is make it very clear. If you're involved in a committee that is about doing stuff, you report to staff. In fact, staff decide who's on the committee. They, in a sense, hire the volunteers, and they can fire them. The board doesn't appoint them. If it is helping the board do its job, say there's like an audit committee, perhaps. Most chambers don't bother with a committee. They operate as a committee of the whole in that regard. But nominating, these kinds of things, they're just doing what the board has asked them to do so that the board's work gets done more effectively. And that's quite appropriate. They report directly to the board. The problems we get into are way into the planning of an event. Like lots of chambers will have a committee that helps make that happen if they don't have a lot of staff. This is where the messes happen because people's preferences start to drive the event where they want it to go, and there's been no communication. Anyway, you've seen it all, Frank.
I've seen a lot, but in this, we have a big saying in the chamber industry that you've seen one chamber, you've seen one chamber.
Yeah.
You know, that brings up something that just came up in our chamber professionals group on Facebook. Is a chamber discovered that their one of their committees, their ambassador committee, had their own checkbook, basically ran as they saw fit, but worked under the 50C6 of the chamber. And one of the concerns that came up was, well, what about fiduciary duty here of the board members to know what's going on? You can't have this rogue committee. So that's another thing you got to watch out for. I'm sure.
Totally agree, and I did trail on some of the comments, and I agree that that's way offside. And again, best of intentions, I expect. Let's just give them the benefit of the doubt. But no, the board is accountable for everything that's going to be happening. They need to have systems and controls in place, and it sounds like there was no control in that. Again, not presuming that the ambassadors were doing something offside, but it needs to be under the oversight of the board, or it can go into a ditch, and then the board's going to be liable and no defense, basically.
Right. It's kind of risky to be a board member, isn't it? I mean, if you do your best, and I'm not a lawyer, and I don't think you're a lawyer either here, so we won't get into the legal weeds, but if you take your board membership lackadaisically, you don't do your work, you don't show up, that's pretty risky. You got real duties, real legal duties, and a lot of people don't take it serious enough, do they?
I agree, and sadly, we're seeing all kinds of this show up in ugly ways. People are not just going to let organizations away with trying hard but not doing very well. I know of situations where small nonprofits the board members have been sued for wrongful dismissal of a volunteer.
Huh.
Now, you wonder, well, how could that even work? But, well, it was a big deal, and the volunteer that was dismissed in a very inappropriate way had a business that was then kind of censored in the community, and they could show that they lost business because of that, and the individual board members had to pay like hundreds of $1,000s of damages between them because of that wrongful dismissal of a volunteer. So goodness, we got to take things very seriously in that leadership role.
Yeah, I think it's a bit of a new world, in the chamber industry at least. I mean, it's always been hard, difficult, running organizations never easy, even though it might look so from the outside, but it's getting harder and harder, more and more fast-paced, more and more regulations, and we do great work, but it just doesn't happen by happenstance.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, Jim, how can people get in touch with you, and what's your specialties? How do you serve?
Well, people can reach us at our website, www.strive.com. There's all kinds of other contact means through that, phone and email. We love to help boards get clear about what their job really is. Often we're called in the messier situations where, as you, the example you gave earlier, where you've got the one kind of rogue board member and they just don't know how to address it. We can help with that. I haven't seen this happen, but again, I haven't seen as nearly as much as you, where we have the chamber CEO who is really the person who needs to be ejected from the situation, and boards can sometimes be intimidated about how to do that in an appropriate way. There's the legal part, which is you're going to want to get some legal help with that, but then there's just kind of the how do you govern through that, how do you work through the transition, how do you prevent that from happening the next time. These are the kinds of things that we help boards do to really understand their role, to focus on their role, which includes, by the way, long-term planning. So we're often involved in helping organizations, boards, work with management to develop the strategy that then management creates the operating plan to implement from.
Fantastic. And again, it's strive.com. The book is The Imperfect Board Member, which is, it's not necessarily a small book, but it's kind of a quick read because it's a story. It's a parable. And
Right.
very readable and great book. I really enjoyed reading it.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Frank.
All right, Jim. Well, you take care. Thank you so much.
Thank you.